Welcome to the Stoa, another session of Stealing the Culture with Dialogos. And today the tractor is Being a Man, and we have a star-studded lineup: Jack Donovan, Cadell Last, Ole Bjerg, and Nina Power, all past guests at the Stoa. And this is a kind of cool session because this is one of those weird conversational combinations that would never happen anyplace else except the Stoa. So I'm quite excited about that. And each person who's going to be on the Dialogos panel today has written about masculinity or being a man in some capacity. Jack Donovan, of course, has written The Way of Men in his new book that I just ordered, Fire in the Dark, Men and Gods. Ole Bjerg wrote The Meaning of Being a Man. He was on the Stoa recently. Cadell Last co-authored Sex, Masculinity, and God. And Nina Power has a book coming out called What Do Men Want? So it's kind of exciting to see what emerges from this conversation. And I'll explain how it's going to work today in a moment. But if everyone except the guests will turn off their camera, because that will help the YouTube video just show their faces, and we can bring you back in during the Q&A. So how today is going to work, we're going to start with a question. The question is, what is the best way to be a man today? And I will tag in one of the speakers first, and then they will have about 5 minutes to answer that question. And then if the speaker could tag in someone else that hasn't spoken yet, and then they will answer the question, then the go around until all four has answered that question for about 5 minutes. And then once everyone answered the question, then the conversational space will open up. So for the remainder of 45 minutes, just have a kind of Dialogos type conversation on what has occurred. Nina Power will take kind of the soft lead on the kind of like the Dialogos conductor. And then for 30 minutes or 25 to 30 minutes, we'll have a Q&A. So if you have any questions, put them in the chat. I'll call on you, unmute yourself, ask your question to the panel. We're here for 90 minutes in total. So that being said, I'll give everyone access to unmute themselves. And how about I will take in Cadell, and then Cadell could start, and then Cadell, after you go, you take in someone else, and then until all four are spoken. So.
All right, thanks. Really great to be here, and even though I haven't spoken with any of the other panelists, I'm familiarized myself with their work and really excited to just discuss with all of you and to really learn. For me, if we're starting with this question, what does it mean to be what does it mean to be a good man? What does it mean to be, what's the exact question? Like basically the ethics of being a man. I think that the basic problem is that there's a divide between what I would call ethics and morality, and that there's no overall moral order. Like I would say that in the past, the overall moral order would have been the patriarchy or Christianity. And the patriarchy and Christianity as a moral order would have given you a type of ethical directive for how to be a good man. And we don't have that ethical directive anymore, and it's painful. And I would even go further to say that what unifies ethical problems is pain. The reason why it's an ethical problem is because it's painful. Otherwise, it just wouldn't be an ethical problem. And so when it comes to asking the question of what does it mean to be a good man today, I start on a personal level with, where is my pain located? Why have I even come to this point of writing about masculinity? And I would say that the answer to that question is twofold. The first is that there's an enormous pain with trying to what I would call unify sexuality and love. And in my history, in my personal past, just like probably every other human being, I've struggled immensely with unifying sexuality and love, and I've gone through enormous, what I would call affective catastrophes, where I've had to fundamentally reorganize my ethical behavior around how I conduct myself as a man and how I envision myself as a man, specifically in relationship to the opposite sex. The second pain point, I would say, is the pain point of every man in my family and in my extended family network really was destroyed by the modern social system. They ended up dead very early. They ended up addicted. All of my male cousins are addicts or in prison. So there's a way in which these affective catastrophes have pointed me towards deep questions about how I want to embody myself as a man and how I can both avoid the affective catastrophes of the past and also share my wisdom with other men so they don't make the same mistakes I made in the past. And starting with that place, I would say on an intellectual level, now moving from the personal level, on the intellectual level, I became very attracted to Freudian psychoanalysis. And in Freudian psychoanalysis, we start with masculinity as the paradigm of sexuality. Libido is masculine in Freudian psychoanalysis. Now, the important point about the splits within psychoanalysis here become, I think, essential for the discussion moving forward. And I think there's two major splits that occur. And this has relevance also perhaps to Nina's book, What Women Want, because of course, Freud famously asked the question, what do men want? Because Freud asked the question, what do women want? So when it comes to the splits within psychoanalysis, there's two, at least huge splits that I'm focused on. The first split is with Jung, which many people know about. And my personal view is Jung is a mistake. Not just a small mistake, a huge mistake. And the reason why Jung is a mistake is because he's not a psychoanalyst, basically. And so it's a false debate in some sense, because he's more striving for a mystical consciousness, a pre-modern, pre-psychoanalytic mysticism than really a deepening of psychoanalysis. Now, the second split, which I'm interested in, and this is where I sort of fall, is the split internal to Freud himself. So the split internal to Freud himself is the death drive. So basically you have libido as masculine, and then you have the death drive. And the death drive as going into death itself, not going into the feminine, going into death itself as the way to both understand the most disturbing elements of affective catastrophe, but also as a way to build, I would say, almost an indestructible spirit. Now, in that sense, what does it mean to be a man today? I have some concrete, simple ideas. On the simplest idea is that to be a man today is to confront failure and to confront death with the type of courage that men in the past would identify as with success. To be a successful man, to be a man of God, instead of being a man that's too identified with success, instead of being a man that's too identified with God, I would say to become a man who grows from constantly learning from failure and constantly be willing to deepen one's spirit in the fact that you're a mortal finite being. And the fact that you're a mortal finite being gives you limitation. It gives you a sense of direction. It gives you a sense of immediacy, which I think is missing in a lot of men today because they don't know how to orient themselves, again, without the traditional moral order, and the traditional moral order being the patriarchy and the Christianity. So there's a huge void. So to conclude, basically, there's a huge void And that void used to be God and patriarchy, which I think is a false filling of the void. And there's an opportunity to go deeper into the core of one's self. And I would say the reason why this is specifically an ethical problem for men, as opposed to why wouldn't someone say, why isn't this an ethical problem for all humans, men and women? Well, I would say it's an ethical problem for men in a unique way, because the number one failing I've seen in the traditional man is a type of clinging to the woman or a clinging to the feminine in a way that's ultimately self-destructive and undermining one's own being. And so instead of, like, for example, I've spent a lot of time with traditional men where basically I asked them, if your wife died, how would you react? And they would say, I just want to die, basically. Basically, if they lose their wife, if they lose their significant partner, they just collapse into nothingness. So there's something very deep, something very necessary in confronting this void, which is unique to men because women have a greater, women have the opportunity to fill that void with a child. And they're more connected to life than men naturally. Now, if a woman doesn't have a child, then this question probably becomes a universal one. But that's my end. That's basically my 5 minutes.
Okay, Cadell, who would you like to speak next?
Well, you're next in my panel, so let's go with you.
Okay, all right, so the question was, what is the best way to be a man today? And I suppose I want to begin with a bit of context setting, which is, I mean, how difficult it is even to ask that kind of question. I think in the kind of mainstream liberal media, we see a kind of really concerted effort to create as many divisions as possible between men and women, particularly in terms of forms of resentment. And I think resentment is encouraged between the sexes kind of more or less relentlessly, like it's something of a kind of project of a large amount of the media in several different ways, one of which is to kind of supposedly stress the kind of incommensurable nature of men and women. I mean, this was a slightly earlier project, so something like the John Gray Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus idea, that there's something kind of intractable and impossible about communication between the sexes. You also get this to some extent in a more kind of classy vein in the work of Jacques Lacan and other forms of psychoanalysis. And it may be something, there may be something to this in terms of how we communicate and symbolic order and where meaning resides. But I think the current iteration of this sort of divide between men and women is really predicated on a sense of encouraging resentment. So in the past few years, we've obviously seen a lot of attacks on men in terms of ideas of toxic masculinity, and even the idea that all masculinity is by default toxic. So that in a sense, the answer to the question, what is the best way to be a man today, would be answered by the mainstream media in almost by saying there is no good way to be a man today, right? That to be a man is to be kind of somehow suspect, to be always, you know, having to feel guilty. And I think these kind of moves are incredibly unhelpful. I think men and women do actually cooperate historically. Of course they do. We're all here, right? To some degree, that has to be the case for us, any of us, to be here today. And I think there's lots of different ways in which men and women have cooperated. And it does partly depend upon certain kinds of difference. And you know, we have a kind of contemporary capitalist culture that on the one hand seeks to kind of eliminate differences, you know, like in the workplace, it doesn't matter if you're a man or woman, except if it comes to something like sexual harassment. You know, there's a very uneasy kind of form of equality, which is kind of coupled with a very, very suspicious attitude that's encouraged between the sexes, which I want to say is neither good for men nor for women. I don't think women particularly have a good time in this culture. I don't think the kind of encouragement, let's say, of completely, you know, emotionless or feelingless sexual encounters is particularly great for either men or women. I think the idea of treating other people as, you know, almost like consumerist products to be kind of used and then abandoned is atrocious for any form of kind of collective being or community or genuine affection. And I think we all have to ask serious questions about who benefits from a culture in which our atomization is completely encouraged by the dominant culture. And this question then, just to, I suppose, finish a bit, is like, you know, I would say the best way to be a man today, I suppose, is to, in a way, confront the horror of contemporary culture. And in that sense, I agree with Cadell that this is a question of pain. I think that everybody suffers. I think one of the terrible moves on the left is to say that only some people suffer, or that some people suffer more than others and some people's suffering doesn't count. I think everybody suffers. This is a fact of life, and everybody suffers in different ways. And I think when we're talking about the way in which the sexes suffer differently, I do think they do. I mean, if you look at things like suicide rates among men, they're much higher than they are among women for various reasons, to do with the way it's carried out and so on. But there are kind of complex differences that we actually have to confront head on, and not say, oh, well, men should suffer because they're men and men are somehow bad. I think this is incredibly destructive discourse that we should all do our best to fight, both men and women together. Oh yes, I forgot my own thing. Okay, so I'm going to pass on to Ole, I think, with his wood pile.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I think this is just a great question. And for me, philosophy is 80% asking the right questions. And I think a lot of conversations, especially about men and women, they get sidetracked from the get-go because they start with the wrong question. So when I received this question on email, I was just like, brilliant. We don't have to spend the first half hour to trying to figure out. We just, yeah, right there. So, yeah. And one of my favorite philosopher is Martin Heidegger, exactly because he has this craft or this skill of asking good fundamental questions. And I would say with this question, we are on Heidegger level here. So whoever came up, if it's Peter or you, Nina, who came up with this question, well done. One of the concepts that Heidegger talks about, he talks about Jemeinigkeit in German. It calls mineness. And one of the beauties of this particular question is that it has that character that we all have it, or at least those of us who are men. For us, it's not just a philosophical question, it's an existential question that we have to face every single day of our lives. We need to kind of deal with this question. What is the best way to be a man today? And it's a question that we're kind of born with. If you look at, I have two sons, like they're struggling with this question every day. Like it's kind of like just in them in a way. The way I like to think about this question, or it's not so much in terms of the distinction between men and women, but more the distinction between being a man and being a human being. Because to me, that's not the same. Of course, I am both, but when I relate to myself as a human being or as a man, that's two different things. And to some extent, this is a very rough sketch here, but in some ways, I think a lot of moral philosophy has been concerned with the question of what is the best way to be a human being today? And we go into like principles and rules and all that kind of stuff, which is all well and good, but it doesn't really, there's something lost in this, or something that moral philosophy doesn't grasp. And I think this other question, what is the best way to be a man? The way we can evaluate that is more through the logic of a story. So my answer to the question would be the best way to be a man is to live in a way that would make a good story. And we know that when we hear a story, we sort of instinctively know, is this a good story or not? And it says something about, both the one that's telling the story, but certainly, of course, also the person in the story. And I want to share a story here, and then we can see how it works. And it's about a man. I don't know him, but I have a friend who's a really good storyteller, and it's his old friend. And my friend, his name is Jakob, he has this arsenal of story about this person. And his nickname is Spalten, which means the crack. And no one knows why he's called the crack. He's just called the crack. So there's this whole series of crack stories, or not crack stories, but about the crack. So one story was, so the crack, Spalten, I'll call him Spalten, he was playing football. So one day or one weekend, his football team, they went to a summer house to drink beers and do what you did, right? So they were this group of men, young men, and they were here. And it was in the winter, so there was snow outside. And they were drinking beers. And then, of course, at some point, they had to go out and pee. And then they sort of erupted this competition, who can write something in the snow when they were peeing and stuff. And then at one point, and they would compete about this. And then at one point, Spalten had left. And then someone looked at the window, and then they said, "Oh, the crack is opening." So what happened was that he had put his buttocks on the window. Spalten had done that. And then they were looking at that a little bit, like, and then they carried on. And then at some point, like, the eye is opening. And now here's a little trigger warning here. There's something gross coming up, because Spalten would shit on the window. And of course, he kind of then won the competition, and he came in, and people were like, "Oh yeah, fine," and they would drink on. And then the next day, because it had frozen, it was in the winter, so it had frozen, and they had rented the summer house. So the shit has frozen. So they had to take it away with a chisel. I think that's what you call, like, yeah. So this is one of these Spalten stories. So what's the point here of this story? Is that I think if we were to evaluate it through Kant or someone else, is this a good behavior? Probably not. But it's certainly a good story. So in some ways, I think it is in a way a good way to live your life, right? Shit on a win. This happened probably 20 years ago, and I still tell this story. So in that way, Spalten has sort of given something to me, even though I don't know it. He's given something to the world that is kind of carried forward in this story. And then, of course, there's also, I think that comes to the difference between the moral of being a human being and then being a good man, which is kind of evaluated in this story logic. First of all, the story is always contextual. So there's a lot more contextual. So it's not like we can say, yes, so you can always shit on windows. No, of course you can't. But in this particular instance, you can. And then there's another thing about stories, is that you kind of need to renew things. So if you were to live by Kant's moral imperative, you could just do the same thing over and over and over again. And you can do the same as all the others who are also applying this principle. You can't do that as a man. You need to come up with new things, right? You need to, because otherwise it's not a good story. If I were to do the same thing, people would say, yeah, you're just doing like Spalten. We've heard that story before. We want a new story. So I have to come up with something. So there's also something in that drives men to kind of like, we want to try new things. We want to do something else. We've heard that story before. So to sum up, my sort of answer to this, and there's another thing also, is that you kind of like stories, they kind of inhabit the landscape. They can do all kinds of different things, which also means that there's a huge like division of labor between men. We all have to do different things in our lives and contribute in very different ways. Whereas I think moral philosophy is more by sort of going by the same principles, the same rules, but there's something else in this being a man. And finally, and I think that also corresponds a little bit with what you said, Cadell, is that there's failure. There's always some kind of failure in good stories also. And that's part of being a man. Part of being a man is also fail in a good way. Whereas as a human being, there's not so much room for failure. But as a man, there's no, So fail good to make a good story. So that's it for me. And Jack? You need to unmute yourself.
Boom. All right. Well, I like what you had to say there. I always say that I prefer to be and have my friends be men who could easily be drawn into graphic novels. You picture a guy like, oh, you can make him into a superhero or a character in a graphic novel really easily. He's a good character in a story. So I always I enjoy that. As far as the best way to be a man today, I think, as other members of this panel have said, you have to identify what question you're actually asking. The first one is, are you being a good man or a good person? And those are two different things. And what is the difference between me, a good man, and a good person? And I wrote about this in The Way of Men a little bit. It's been a popular distinction. The difference between being a good man and being good at being a man. And those are two very different things. Like, being a good man is very cultural. And it has to go with, as I think Cadell said, we have this collapse of morality that Nietzsche talked about, the death of gods and so forth in the world. Whereas we don't have an agreement on what the consensus of what being a good person is, much less being a good man. There is no agreement, and therefore there's a lot of confusion. And so that changes from culture to culture. What means to be a good man in Louisiana might be very different from what it means to be a good man in San Francisco, depending on your social group and so forth. But being good at being a man, I think, is very old. And it has to do with art, what distinguishes being a man from being a woman. And what are the, men, how do they distinguish themselves from being women? By, as Cadell said, I think there's some encounter with death and overcoming of fear and, assuming risk and doing all the things that our mothers don't want us to do, basically. Like, we have to go out and get hurt and, struggle through things that are dangerous and scary. And that hasn't changed. Courage being a facet of masculinity hasn't changed in any culture. It's always there. It's always important. And I think that, so we constantly have to go and face, threats and the threat of death and pain and so forth. And I find that a lot of men today, because we live in a very kind of mommied world where we're not supposed to get hurt, we're not supposed to get outside because we might get sick. We're not supposed to, when I do jujitsu, I got choked out the other night, went to sleep. And my mom, first thing she says is stop doing that. Like, well, that's a really important way that I express my masculinity, to go and fight other men. And I think that a lot of it is, as the Greeks would say, it's a finding a balance between these things. Because we have a lot of guys in society who have never had any kind of physical confrontation. They've ever had any kind of physical conflict. They've never done anything that's scary. And they need to seek that out a little bit more. And on the other hand, I know guys who have gone to, Iraq and stacked bodies, and they've done the warrior role, and they generally need to do a little bit of the other thing. They need to come back and find that balance and deal with the perpetuation of life and enjoying being alive and having joy and making families and so forth. Planting a garden. So there's I think a lot of what it means to, the best way to be a man is to find balance. And I think that's always been true. I mean, the Greeks talked about that constantly, like eudaimonia, and like, how do you find the balance between the role that society prescribes for you, whatever that is, and this kind of primal sense of being that needs to go out and express strength and assert your will and seek out risk and so forth. And if you don't find that balance, I think men end up being very unhappy and very unfulfilled. Because I like editing photos and setting up lighting and doing all kinds of things. There's all kinds of things that I don't need to have any kind of risk in my life at all to do and enjoy. But I think that a lot of people and a lot of men do that. I mean, I'm a writer. Men who write or do computers or whatever for a living, that's great. But I think that they feel at some point that there's something missing if they don't go out and have that other side. That other side that seeks conflict and that seeks, risk and so forth. So I think, again, it's just for each man, because we all have different roles and we all do different things. it's about finding a balance there. So I don't know, is that 5 minutes? I wasn't really paying attention, but it seemed to wrap itself up. So
yeah, no, I think that's great. I think everyone was basically really well behaved vis-a-vis the clock. And yeah, I mean, I suppose one interesting thing might be to think about a thread perhaps that links across our different points, because I think we're all coming from slightly different places. Obviously, I mean, I'm not a man in the first place, though I've spent the last few years talking to a lot of them and reading a lot of what they have to say. And so I think this question of pain is very interesting. I think the question of risk is very interesting. I think in terms of the kind of relationship between men and women, and there's a kind of perhaps a slight tension maybe between what I'm saying and some of what you're saying, which is I think Cadell in particular, but also Jack and Ole as well, is almost like an image of a kind of autonomous man. Like the man in the first place, in a way, needs to work out the question, needs to have a relation to the world, needs to kind of establish a sense of almost like separation, separation from the culture, separation from the feminine, and to establish something there. So I'm just wondering if there's something we can bring together in the discussion about the relation between the individual man, I suppose, and being a man in that sense, and then the kind of the way in which we live in an increasingly mixed world, whether we like it or not. It's like it's very, very hard to live in a kind of sex segregated way, even if we wanted to. And I looked a lot at the MGTOW tendency, men going their own way. And I tried to think about this in relation to some images of like 70s feminist separatism. So, they're very different in some ways, but they were both attempts to live without the opposite sex. And I suppose it's maybe interesting to try to think a bit more about this relation between the autonomous individual man and the mixed culture. Like, what is it like to be a man? Let's revise the question. What is the best way to be a man to women today?
Can I speak?
Yeah, go ahead.
I was actually, so there was a thing about the question. It was also what is the best way to be a man today? And I think some of what I think all of you talk about resonated well with me. There's this thing about risk, this natural propensity to kind of seek risk as a way of being a man. And I think what I see happening today is that we live in I think what we're seeing today is the shadow side of the feminine. I think that's what we're seeing with Corona. It's also actually what we saw with the financial crisis, because the financial crisis, or the way we handled that, was also a zero risk tolerance. It's like no one can fail. No banks can go down. So like this mother central bank came in and said, no banks can fail. I will carry you. So we didn't take the hit. So we still have these problems, and they've exacerbated. I'm studying this. So yeah. And I think the same thing is playing out now with Corona. We can accept zero deaths. And that's totalitarianism. But the kind of totalitarianism that we know from the 20th century, I think was a masculine form of totalitarianism. It's like, oh, we'll rule the world, we'll kill all the Jews and that kind of stuff. And now we're seeing a feminine version of totalitarianism, which is a more subtle one. And it's one that kind of takes care of you. But it takes care of you so much that all kind of, there's like a distinction there's a distinction between, in Danish, there's, I don't, surviving and living your life, right? So it's like, oh, I'll take care of you to survive. But in order to survive, you will have to give up your life, as in living your life. I think that's, that for me that's the shadow side of femininity. And the response, I think, should be, we need men to stand up. We also need women to stand up, both of them, to this. I think both of us have something certainly to contribute here.
Cool. I'll jump in. Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree that it's a feminine form of totalitarianism, because it is about nurturing. It's like, I'm going to take care of you, and everything's going to be okay. You just have to do what I say, and so it's, and in a way, it's not allowing us to be born. You know, it's this nurturing, like, hold us in the womb, and we can't ever have risk. We can't ever go outside, and you can never be born. And being born is really a kind of initiation. And Nina actually said something in her talk about basically, you know, the differentiation between men and women and so forth, and going out as an individual man and being, you know, becoming. And that's really all about initiation. And that's what initiation always is. Like, you were you had one role, and then you transition to another role. And really, when men aren't allowed to take risks, they aren't allowed to take that step. And so they're always children, really. Like, they're always kept to be children. But then Nina also asked about you know, how is the best way to be a man to woman? Isn't that what she said?
Yeah, I forgot that. That was also a good touch. Yeah. So
yeah. So I mean, I think that in a way, the most powerful word that men can say sometimes is no. And we're kind of trained never to say no, and always to apologize, and in a very polite society where it's very submissive. And I think that what women need to hear sometimes, and what men need to say, is no. And they need to set boundaries. And this is, like, you know, this is what society needed to say with some of the things that have been going on over the past year. No, we're good. You know, we don't need to be protected this much. No, we need, you know, we're not going to do this anymore. And I think that, because I often hear, obviously, I talk to men who are, you know, pickup artists, but also men who are married successfully and have really good, healthy marriages. And no is a really big theme with that as well, because men have to set boundaries and say, no, this is who I am. I need to go out and spend time with other men. No, you can't just tell me what to do all the time. And if they don't say that, women don't respect them. Yeah, like, women don't respect them as men. And so I think the best way to be a man to woman is to be able to set boundaries, distinguish yourself as a man, because I think women respect men who know who they are and who are confident more than they respect men who will just do whatever they say.
Okay, Cadell, did you want to add anything on this?
I think he disappeared.
Oh, I can see him. He's.
You can see him. I can't see him.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can see him.
Cadell, are you?
I'm having internet connection problems.
Oh, he's frozen.
Okay. Do you want, maybe if you turn the video off and just use the mic, maybe?
Can I comment on this woman thing while he gets his? Yeah. So I think something I've thought about in relation to feminism is that I feel that right now we're living in a time where things mean the opposite, like sort of the direct opposite of what we think they mean. So, and one of these things is feminism. You would think feminism, oh, that's about promoting femininity, you would think, but it's the opposite. It's like saying to women, yes, you can be like the men on their own term. Yes, you can also be masculine. Yes, you can all this. And on the one hand, I mean, there's liberating elements of that, which I totally think is fine. But I think in the mix, what happens is also that, like, there's parts of femininity which is actually devalued extremely. Like, for instance, the fact that women can give birth to new human beings is a miracle. And there's nothing that a man can do which even compares to that. You can go to the moon, you can whatever. Nothing compares to creating a new human being. So, and I think we are losing. We should, like, be celebrating that and say, oh, you should, wow. So I think that's one thing that we as men can, or a good way of being a man towards a woman is of course, allowing her to express herself whichever way she wants, but also really appreciating and honoring her femininity and the things she can do as a woman. And I think we're too. It's like I think that what has happened in the way we've organized society is we have all of these where we were like, here's the men, here's the women. We have these mixed spaces, and I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. But it seems like our solution, or in order to be in those spaces, we kind of say, well, then we need to pretend that we are all just human beings. No one can be a man, no one can be a woman. For instance, in the workplace, it's like, oh, we should just be human beings. And I think there's a huge resource there that is untapped. And it's kind of some of the same things is happening in the family. You kind of like, yeah, take away sort of not as much as in the workplace, but still taking away some of the special features of each of the two. And I think that would be something I would like us to see in the future is, yes, we share spaces, but we share them as men and women. That would be great. Not just as two different human beings.
Yeah, and I think just briefly on this, I mean, also to celebrate and recognize the fact that sometimes men and women want to spend time with their own sex, you know, whether it's, you know, whatever the reason, you know, but this is actually something that's kind of been stripped out of our contemporary culture as well. I think in the past, there would have been a lot more opportunity for women to spend time with women and men to spend time with men. And whilst we, in a way, you know, we have to accept that we live in a modern world and that things are mixed and workplaces are mixed, and there isn't any going back, perhaps. But nevertheless, I think that there's often a kind of denigration of the desire of men to spend time with other men, for example. And I think this has really bad knock-on effects in terms of mentorship. And, you know, there's often a suspicion, let's say, of men working with younger men and so on, and all of those kinds of things. Again, it's sort of along the lines of protection, not taking risk and so on. And of course, when those things go wrong, it's really, really bad. But it you know, that shouldn't prevent a culture from you know, embracing, let's say, the wisdom that an older man would have to share with younger men, or whatever, you know, without finding that also embarrassing as well, you know. And I think, you know, to just kind of because there are so few rituals, there are so few kind of shared experiences of growing up, or, you know, I mean, if you're in a religious community, those things might be marked in a particular way, but in general, in the general secular Western culture, you know, there isn't a kind of a shared understanding of nature or rituals or the progression of time and the difference between men and women, and the need for separate time as well together. Cadell, have you sort of, yeah, great.
Yeah, so I think I mean, of course, I agree with a lot of what's been said, you know, about the politics of feminine totalitarianism as a type of totalizing care, which prevents you from being born in essence. I think that's basically an epidemic. I think that it does have a solution, and it has nothing to do with thinking about how men should be with women. I think it has to do with men basically engaging in a type of what's in essence a type of man-circling, or some equivalent of man-circling, where there's a group of men which are explicitly sort of a personal brotherhood, where you have personal accountability long-term, where you have men collectively going into their truth, and that helps men to both differentiate themselves from female values, and it helps them to set their own boundaries and get a perspective on sort of sharpening their own mission, or basically being brave enough to be someone who's worthy of a good story. Because the crucial thing I wanted to say in relationship to what Ole, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing the name right, Ole was saying, was that I would say, and this is, I think, a very precise philosophical point, and I would say a Hegelian point, is that death is more primary than narrative. So in order to understand that death is more primary than narrative, what I want you to think is there will be an experience or an event in your life which you'll never be able to tell a story about. Meaning, like, if I go out and get hit by a bus, I can't come back and tell you guys about it. Right? So death is more primary than the story, and any story which jumps ahead into the future ahead of its time is false, because reality is so much more complex than you. You can only have a good story after the fact, meaning you have to live deeply, and in order to live deeply, you can't live like Kant, because Kant behaved like a robot. Kant behaved like a repetitive algorithm. He just did the same thing over and over and over again. And if there was any deviation in Kant's life, he would actually get physically ill. So he was trying to prevent actually taking a risk. He was actually trying to prevent doing anything genuinely new. And so doing this genuinely new, going into death itself as something that's necessary for men and something that helps them break away from feminization is, I think, the part of the ethical task today. And I think the reason why this isn't being done is because we're implicitly living in a culture that pretends sexual difference doesn't exist. And the problem with that is that you have a model, basically an unconscious model projected onto everyone, that everyone's like this, basically like a non-sexual entity. So we need a spiritual mediation of the body, which starts with the fact that some spirits have penises, some spirits have vaginas. This creates a developmental difference in the logic of the spirit's development. And maybe we can avoid totalitarianism on both sides. I don't know what the equivalent. My question to you, Nina, would be: I've had a lot of conversations with men in a positive way about the power of, you know, something like a man circle, but is there like a feminine equivalent, or does it just happen more spontaneously, naturally among women to circle?
Yeah, hard to answer. I mean, being on one side of the divide, but I mean, I just want to say there was fantastic comments, Cadell, and it fitted in very well actually with the question that Lara is asking in the questions, so maybe when we get to that point in about 10 minutes, I'd really like to ask Lara to ask her question, because it's really relevant to what Cadell was just saying. I think in terms of the kind of sex segregated spaces, I mean, I think there's a way in which women, I don't know, first of all, I just want to say, I suppose, that it's true that it's basically become extremely difficult to talk about sexual difference today, you know, in almost every circle. And, you know, probably all of us have been in trouble for even suggesting that sexual difference is, you know, has relevance, has social consequences, you know, needs to be discussed politically and legally and so on. And there's something very profound about this crisis in this conversation. Like, there's something going wrong in our culture when we can't talk about sexual difference, and it's something that's going wrong for both men and for women, right? I think this is a crisis of metaphysics, a crisis of meaning, and a crisis of our collective life together. So when we're talking about sex segregated spaces, whether they're kind of chosen, you know, voluntary, or whether they're kind of public, you know, segregated spaces, you know, we know that this is very contentious, and it shouldn't be, but it is. And I think women, you know, at the risk of generalizing, there is sometimes a kind of intuitive relation between women. You know, it's quite hard to explain. It's very interesting if you're all women in a particular place, like if you're 9 women together, let's say, it becomes very witchy in some kind of curious way. It's an interesting question what it means to be witchy. This is in a space, let's say, without children present. It's very interesting. There's some kind of different way of communicating, I would say, almost, that is quite ineffable and quite difficult to describe. But it is very real, and I think those experiences of being in sex segregated spaces are very vivid and very meaningful, actually. They're an opportunity to do and think different things, and to relate differently to the world, and to in some ways have a break from our very mixed world and our very complicated world. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, this question just on the feminine totalitarianism. I mean, it's a very interesting point. I mean, it's quite a provocative way of putting it, because of course, you know, my feminist side might want to say, yeah, but a lot of the time the people making these decisions are men, you know, empirically and so on. But that doesn't discount the larger point.
Can I interject here?
Yeah.
The people who are making these decisions, they're not men. They are human beings. They
Sure.
are persons. If you look at all of these men, Dr. Fauci, the English guy, Matt Hancock, whatever his name is.
Hancock, yeah.
Yeah, Hancock. All of these men, there's a Danish equivalent as well. All of they're not men. They're just persons.
Yeah, no, I take the point. I think you're right. I write about this in the book.
I'm not disagreeing with you.
Yeah.
But there's something in it. And it's something that really struck me when I see this. I see these non-men. It's not like they're women. They're just persons.
They're
maybe unsexed. They're reptiles.
They're unsexed, they say. Exactly. Yeah.
Underless worm people. Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, I take the point that you know, it's a very important point actually. Like when we meet someone for the first time, do we see them as a person? Do we see them as a man? Do we see them as a woman? It's actually very complicated. And I take Ole's point very seriously, that in a way, with, you know, there is a kind of humanism of the worst actually. You know, that we are governed by desexed, unsexed eunuchs, essentially, all of us. And
Mandarins,
it's not good, it's not good for men or for women. But I suppose, you know, my point is you're still using the word feminine totalitarianism, and it's very provocative, right? I think it's a very interesting way of putting it, this excess of care, the attempt to eliminate death. And I suppose I want to make a slight plea for the relation of women to death too. I think women have an immense and powerful relation to death. Of course they do. So I take the point. I mean, and to be feminine is not obviously to be female, right? So when we're talking about, you know, the totalitarian feminine or the dark side of the feminine, the excessive care, I mean, it is a care that kills, let's say. You know, there is a form of protection and care that is deadly. You know, I don't disagree. So perhaps can
I say something
Yes.
something to the feminine relationship to death? Because in my experience, and I'm just drawing this from, I'm trying to stay very grounded in what's going on in my personal life, what I observe in my personal relationships, in order to ground this analysis, because it's very easy to get sucked up into generalizations that are too simple. But what I see is, and in my conversations with women who go deep into this, is that a woman's relationship to death has a lot to do with the very act of going through pregnancy and the birth itself. And also the death has a lot to do with separating from the child in identity when the child's growing up. And I think that a lot of women are scared to confront pregnancy, and they're scared to distance their identity from the child as they're growing up. And there's this clinging to a type of care with no pain. And this care with no pain is translated into bad politics in some sense, of this creating like a eternal safe space of some kind. And I think that I don't know if men have the same capacity to develop a relationship like that, just by virtue of the fact that our bodies are so different. And that for example, I think the equivalent in like the jargon would be like, every time a man masturbates, he has a little death, for example. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry, there's a bit of interruption in the sound there. But yeah, this idea of the little death, you know, the orgasm, the male orgasm in particular. Yeah, I mean, you know, this is a very old idea in Chinese alchemy, and you know, the idea of and you know, if you think about semen retention, and I'm very interested in the no fap movement as a kind of almost resurrection of these ancient ideas. You know, there's and of course that gets associated with the right somehow, you know, that anyone who's interested in these sorts of things must be somehow a fascist or along those lines. And I mean, maybe it would be interesting to talk about that a little bit, maybe for 5 minutes or so, about the politics of all this, because, you know, not only is it difficult to talk about sexual difference, but when men and women do, they are invariably and very quickly accused of being right wing or conservative at best and Nazi at worst. And I think, I don't know, it might just be interesting to reflect a little bit on the politics of this. Like, what is this smearing? What is the function of that, I suppose? Jack.
Yeah, I first I want to talk about a little bit about what you said about the people, the men, the people making those decisions are often men. And I think that and it folds into the political thing, because I think we can't assume that they're making decisions as men. We can assume that they're making decisions as opportunists. And I think that really, if you look back at some of the arguments for even giving women the vote and so forth, it was very much, well, we think we can manipulate them faster. And so I think that men will tell women what they want to hear to manipulate them. And so I don't think that they're speaking as men or even speaking truthfully about what they actually believe. You see all these celebrities who that are going and having sex with all kinds of women and doing all kinds of things, and then they'll get in a magazine and they'll tell women what they want to hear. And that's a really good way to make money, is just tell women what they want to hear. And in terms of the political landscape, I think, of the world, because of some of the qualities that women have that they're better at than men, women are really good at social interaction. And when I worked briefly on a recall campaign for a female politician, actually in Oregon, what I noticed is that women were doing all the heavy lifting, and this was even like in the Republican Party. The women were doing all the work. They were the ones who were knocking on doors and calling their friends and like getting things organized and whatever. And the men were just sitting back waiting for a war to happen, But the women were doing all the social organizing. And so really, to make political wheels spin, I think in a lot of ways, it's really about reaching out to women and seeing what they say, because the men are just sitting at their home grumbling in many cases. And that's what I'm seeing in the world. But women are the ones who are even on the left or the right, who are doing most of the work. They're the ones who are going out and signing petitions and so forth, and increasingly becoming the political figures. So I think that a lot of these men who are making decisions that seem very maternal are really appealing to their female voter base.
Yeah, fair enough. Does Ole or Cadell want to come back in on this, maybe on the political dimension?
I have a point on this death thing, because I
Okay.
do think there's a key difference in the way that men and women relate to death. And I think it has, but we all, there's something in all of us that kind of wants to live forever in a way, or at least live in a way that transcends death. I think this is kind of where, one of the points where I think Heidegger is kind of, I'm missing something. So, and I think Hannah Arendt, she has a better grasp of this. And a woman, she can create a new human being that will transcend her death. So she will, after she's died, it kind of still lives. Whereas men, we don't have the same direct access to that. Of course, I mean, we do have a share in it, I know, but still. So I think our alternative, in a way, is to create stories that will live after our lives. And it's true, as Cadell says, yes, if you get run over by a bus or killed in a war, you can't tell your own story, but you're hoping that someone else will. That's the image of the hero. The hero is someone who dies, and then people tell the story of him. And in that way, he lives on. And when men, and also some women, I don't know. Anyway, I know men live like this. We kind of look at ourselves from the point of view of a future storyteller, which is why some men, they will go into death. They will go into war. They will go into burning buildings. They will go into, and if on one hand, it's meaningless. Why would you do that? You kill yourself. But it's because we kind of, no. In the future, there's going to be someone who's telling the story. He went into a building. Wow. And he died. So, and then there was also something about Cadell raised this about these men's circle. And I've been a lot of these in a lot of these events. And I think they're brilliant. What you do, you get men together, you take the women away. And then what happens is that men stop competing because there's nothing to compete for. And then men, and what happens if they are facilitated right, what opens up is actually the feminine side of men. So we become much more caring about each other, much more emotional, because now there's no women to kind of occupy the space of the feminine, so we can kind of open up. And what happens in that, and I think in order to become a man, it's about relating to your masculinity, but it's certainly also about relating to your feminine side. And I think, anyway, I think some of these men who are making these stupid corona decisions, it's because they have not only do they not have a proper connection to their masculinity, but I think it's even more, they have a really weird relationship to their femininity. They're so afraid of it. So they can't sort of, I don't know. I think, so I think Dr. Fauci, he should be in a men's circle. And then I think the corona crisis would be over in 7 weeks. That's my solution to the corona crisis.
There's a problem in general where people are disconnected from their bodies. Like people in general are I think we can make the general point that there's a tendency within modern society and information society to be disconnected from our bodies and to exist in a type of mind space where you implicitly assume you're going to live forever and you're in this just safe space. And I think that we have to obviously break this illusion. And I think that in order to break this illusion, there is the problem of confronting the fact that the human species appears as sexed. We appear in different bodies. This in principle means that there's a different spiritual mediation, but that doesn't mean that there isn't sort of a shared human spiritual process. It's just that the shared spiritual human process is occurring within sexed bodies, and that has a consequence for practical, pragmatic human organizing, and that also requires painful conversations. It requires what you need, not what you want, because just having a society that just gives you what you want, like you press a button and you get instant pleasure forever, it's like that model of society is going to basically infantilize everyone, and no one is going to be brave enough to confront the real, difficult problems of life. Like, so for example, just to give a very quick example, then I stop talking, is like my granddad just died 2 weeks ago. And while he was dying, the so-called people in his life just scattered like gnats or something, like they just were just gone, like they weren't able to be with him in death, because it just counteracted the pleasure principle. It's like, this isn't pleasurable. It's like, we have to be able to go into the things that aren't pleasurable. We need to be brave. We need to be true and real.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that that's also about confronting reality. And I in the book, I tried to talk about the different games, the new games, better games that men and women can play. And I mean games in a very serious way, which is to say, to in a way embrace the absurdity of existence, but also the reality of it and the pain of it together as a kind of collective project, whilst bearing in mind these differences, not pretending that we're all now, as you say, infantile consumer beings who simply enjoy, and our sex is irrelevant to that. It isn't. It couldn't ever be. And I think a lot of this this fantasy of the human is actually shaped by a kind of transhumanist fantasy that somehow we're able to escape our bodies, like you say, Cadell, that we
disconnected from the body.
Exactly. And it's like, this isn't happening. Like, it's not going to happen. And even if it does, it's going to be monstrous. And we shouldn't. Let me say one
very, very quick. The most interesting thing about Ray Kurzweil to me, like the founder of like the modern transhumanist ideology, is, the interesting thing is, in his fantasy, he wants to be a woman. He dreams that he could be uploaded into a computer and then he could explore his feminine fantasies.
Right, of course, and only someone who's never had an experience, an embodied experience of being a woman, could think that, right?
Right.
Like it's a fantasy. It can't be anything else. Okay, I'm going to bring Peter back in now, if he's fantastic.
All right, thank you, Nina. Thank you, everyone. For some reason, I can't get the image of Fauci taking a shit on a window. So thank you for that. Solve all the world's problems. So let there be light in the Stoa. Everyone can turn on their camera, and we'll pivot to the Q&A portion. We probably can squeeze in about 2 questions, and I'll ask the first one. So this is the Stoa, and I'm sort of like a practicing Stoic, but there's really like 99% of the sessions of the Stoa are not about Stoicism. But I'd like to kind of change that. And one of the spiritual projects for year 2 is what I'm calling Stoicism Reborn. And if you know Stoicism, it's about virtue. And that hasn't really been talked about today, or that word has been mentioned. So a question to the panel: what is virtue, and how does it relate to everything that was just said?
Well, virtue, as you probably know, comes from a root that means man. It's vir, and it was originally it really originally meant martial virtue, and all the things that I've talked about as far as like strength, courage, mastery, and honor, and the ability to fight and hunt and all that kind of thing. That was the original virtue, but of course the Greeks embodied it as a female deity, which is always confusing, but they seem to do that in the ancient world. And but then over time they expanded it to become like all these other qualities as well, like qualities that were good for the state, or qualities were good for other people. So I think, to me, I like to be a purist about it and go back to like virtue is a fundamentally male thing, and that doesn't mean females can't have positive qualities, and that they can't have that they don't have it. But I think because of its root, it goes back to something that is basically male. But then that doesn't, like I said, I feel like there needs to be another word for female virtue that doesn't begin with the vir.
Correct on the etymology, although the Greeks did think that the women could participate in vir. So Antigone, for example, when she breaks the law in order to bury her brother's body, is described in the literature as vir. Or andros. So like there's ways in which women can participate, right, when they are very rarely heroic or take action, if you see what I mean.
Absolutely. And she is the best character in that whole like the Theban plays by far.
Yeah, but
I can't wait to. I'm actually reading those right now, so I can't. I previewed that one, and I can't wait to get to that one, because some of the middle one's kind of boring. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean that was just a note on the virtue. But I mean, I think, you know, if you read people like Alistair MacIntyre, you know, we have a crisis, you know, there's a kind of complete crisis of it, you know, even to talk about virtue is to be like passe, you know, let alone specify particular virtues, let alone think about it in relation to sexual difference, you know. So because everything has been kind of reduced to exchangeability, consumerism, enjoyment, you know,
right,
what does it mean to even like exercise restraint, for example, you know?
Well, virtue actually implies a hierarchy of values.
Yeah, exactly.
And that something is better than others.
Exactly.
And that's a very nuclear topic right now. I mean, that's like that's racist to even say that, like that this is, you know, like that it is better to be beautiful than it is to be ugly, that it's better to be strong than it is to be weak. I mean, that's it implies an entire hierarchy of values.
Absolutely.
And so if you don't believe in a hierarchy of values, and I think that is really the modern project, is to do away with the hierarchy of values, because if no one has absolutes of what they believe is good and what they believe is evil, then they're very easy to manipulate, because you can just move the goalposts all the time. Like, this is what's good today on Twitter, and then tomorrow what's good is different. And it's really easy to move mobs of people that way, because they have no roots. You know, really a virtue, you know, a virtue, a value is a destination. It's a point in space that you're oriented towards. And if you have no points in space that you're oriented towards, you can just go with the flow. And so nothing's good and nothing's evil.
I think the way I relate to this in, like, I suppose if I'm going to pull in kind of like the Freudian thesis that the libido is masculine, it's like, and, you know, this equation of virtue being masculine is like basically what do you do with your libidinal energy across an entire lifetime, and that is kind of like your process of becoming virtuous. And in that sense, like, I think that one of the things that structures a lot of Nietzsche's critique in The Collapse of Morality is that a type of virtuous moral order is given to people, and this creates a type of fake virtue because people aren't actually embodied virtuous. They're just copying or mimicking a type of moral order which is given to them by the church or given to them by a certain structure, and that there's an onus on each individual to go into their own capacity to be evil, to actually have an experience of that in order to really be good. Like the idea that in order to really be good, in order to really be virtuous, you have to have a close contact with your own capacity for evil, basically, or your own capacity to abuse your power in some sense. And, you know, in that sense, it is a very, you know, Nietzschean overman project, that each man needs to go to the core of his own being. Each man needs to go to the core of his own self to figure out why, you know, why it's worth being virtuous. You know, why it's why even it's you know, it's selfish to be virtuous, even in some sense.
Well, that actually goes back to what he's saying about a story. I mean, every woman wants the story of your life. If you're concerned with virtue, you want the story of your life to be like, well, he was a virtuous man, and here are all the virtuous deeds that he did. And so, it has to do with legacy, which I like that you were talking about, you know, death and, you know, with Ole and back and forth about the story, the concept of the story, because so much of men are pointed towards legacy in many ways. We want the story about our lives to be exciting, and also, you know, if we're concerned with virtue, then we want it to be virtuous. Like he was a good man. Like, and George Washington is my favorite guy to talk about right now, but he spent a lot of time being very meticulous about his records and how they were kept, because he knew that his story would be told, and he wanted to make sure that it was well accounted for, and so that people got the right impression of what he was trying to do.
I'm happy to open for another question from the audience.
All right, let's pivot to Lara. Lara, you had a question.
Yeah, I think we need to be talking more about biological and physiological differences between men and women. And particularly, I guess my question is, what is the cost to men, women, society, and the planet when women have very different cycles and rhythms with menstruation, with childbearing, with postpartum, and all of this happens sort of in the background, is kind of shut away. So what is the cost to us by not linking up or connecting with these rhythms in any way?
Can I respond to that? I think I agree with kind of the direction of your argument. My answer would be, so I think sometimes the difference between men and women, yes, there are biological differences, but maybe there's a more fundamental ontological difference. So, which means that being in the world as a man is different from being in the world as a woman. And some of these differences has to do with exactly what you're talking about, with the fact that, okay, I'm born into the world in a body that cannot give birth to children. That's just something I have to contend with, figure out. And if you're a woman, you're born into a body that could do other things. So, and I think that's where the biology and the ethics and the virtues kind of intermingle, because the fact that you are born into the world as someone who can give birth to a child is kind of like, it's a little bit like a gift that you need to figure out what to do with. Like, so I know that not all women have children for various reasons, but I do think that all women have to think about this issue. And if you don't have children and you're a woman, it's a big issue to you. Whereas if you're a man and you never get pregnant, it's not a big issue. So I agree with what you're saying.
In fact, I would say it's positive if we don't get pregnant.
And concerning if you do.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Ole. I think that question for a woman is a very serious one, you know, no matter what the decision is, right? And it's, you know, or if you can't have children, you know, it is an issue. It's always going to be an issue. And I think in relation to what Lara was pointing out and asking and stating, very clearly. I completely agree. I think it drives people mental if sexual difference isn't recognized and treated seriously. I think it's actually extremely cognitively disturbing to live in a culture and a society that pretends that these things aren't really real, or it's part of the hatred of the body, all the things we're talking about. And I personally, probably many people have gone through this experience, I suppose, of like serious cognitive dissonance with the larger culture, and thinking, hang on a minute, like, you're sort of being, I don't know, encouraged to kind of dissociate from your own body and the reality of your own ontology and your own physiology, and that's really destructive. So I think, yeah, I mean, it would be interesting, for people to think more about the recognition, as you say, of also different temporality. I mean, this would be an ontological question too. I mean, a really philosophical question would be to say, do men and women experience time differently? Ontologically, yes. Right? Do we have a different relation to time? We were talking about death earlier and life. Hannah Arendt talks about natality, that was mentioned by Cadell, I think. Heidegger's focuses on being towards death, and all we can think about, precisely cyclical time, and what does it mean to actually have a body that relates in a very precise way to lunar cycles, for example. Yes. I mean, even at the same time as women are often taking contraceptive and so on, disrupting let's say a direct relation to nature, but nevertheless, there is a direct and often very painful and feeling of being part of nature, right, that women have, that is a cyclical experience, and that is probably quite hard and probably to explain, and very different from what I imagine men feel like. So that sexual difference is not only a biological thing, but also a metaphysical and philosophical thing, as Ole and I think everyone is saying. Yeah.
I think that your notion here of do men and women experience time differently? I actually had a conversation with a woman recently about this, and the idea that the ovulatory cycle and also the penile erection could be an explanation for why women might experience time as a more cyclical phenomenon, and why men experience time as a more linear phenomenon, always pointing towards a goal. Like it's basically like our mind is basically modeling our joy that we get from the erectile penetration and force that's produced there, but some way in which metaphysics itself includes sexuality as fundamental. And I think that here thinkers like, in my view, thinkers like Kant or thinkers like Heidegger even don't really fully develop a metaphysics inclusive of sexuality, which is why, for me, I do think Lacan is an important philosopher today in some sense, even though he wouldn't call himself a philosopher.
Well, one of the things that I think about time, and that is a neat question, is that do men and women experience time differently? I do think one of the points in my new book, Fire in the Dark, that I wrote about was, I think that men will many cases also die for order. Men need the world to make sense, or they go crazy, and they need to put things in order. And I think that linear model of time, this happened here, this happened then, this happened then, it's very ordered and it makes sense, and you can track it and we can refer back to it and whatever. Whereas I don't think that's as important to women. I don't think, like, this happened then, this happened then. Like, I think that it's a little bit more open as to what's important and when it was important. And I think we're seeing that a lot in public discourse right now. Someone could say something 30 years ago, and it's assumed that it's as if they said it today. Like they've never changed, their views have never changed, they've never thought about anything differently since then. Everything is now, all is one. Yes. Like everything is the same. Whereas men, it's very important to us to be like, this happened in 1933, this happened in 1934, this is the way it goes. And that, if we don't have that, it makes our minds blow up. We need a history,
This is literally happening in my life right now, where like exactly what you're describing. Yeah. Like something 30 years ago is like it's happening right now. It's like, wait, no, there's a linear chain of cause and effect that like has been stretching like back for the last few decades. And
exactly. Yeah, it's a thing. Yeah.
What do you
Right.
mean? The things I thought when I was 4 aren't the same as the things I think, like 30 years later. It's exactly the same, man. Come on.
Yeah.
So let's sneak in one more question for Arn from Arn. Arn, if you can unmute yourself.
Hey guys, thanks for doing this. My question is a little bit abstract. Let me find it real quick. So I think of men as having an expanding energy of going out into the world, and women as kind of having a contracting energy of the world coming to them. And is part of men's struggle the fact that the frontier has receded over time, while the women's inner circle has largely retained its form or even expanded? And is there a solution to this? Does that make sense?
Yes.
I wouldn't mind offering an idea here that I think was connected to something that someone else in the comments, I think Reed Gower, brought up about space exploration, is that men had the fantasy in their head for a long time that the next frontier was going into space. And after we had sort of colonized the planet, the next step, we're going to be on Mars by now. Like, we're going to be on Mars, and then we're going to have a interstellar civilization by 2100 for sure. Like, and all this type of stuff. And that's obviously kind of reaching a ridiculous impossibility. I don't think that that's the frontier. If anyone's going to space, it is already the robots that are going to space, and they're going to be fine in space. And our biological bodies are not probably going to be going there. So I think that identifying the frontier for the man as actually not going into outer space, but going into inner space. And going into inner space requires confrontation with not actual physical death, but the death of one's current identity as the key sort of method, in my experience, to go into inner space and to push your own capacity for being deeper as a type of risk and adventure. I don't know, that would be my starting point for thinking about that.
I think just on the kind of, I think, for the Greeks, there's a separation of like oikos and polis, right? So the oikos is the household and it's the domestic sphere. It's where we get the word for economy from. And the polis is where, men of a particular kind of man, usually property owning, come to discuss how to live best together, right? For everyone, including those people who are in the oikos, right? Which would be women and children and slaves. And one of the things that definitely has happened in terms of this inward-outward thing is that the whole world has become the oikos, right? The whole world is a marketplace, right? So the separation of like the economic and the political is completely over. So you could say in that sense, and it's not like empirical women's fault, but you could say something like the household has become like the model for the polis and for the entire globe, right? Which is really, really weird. So there's no separation anymore between these kind of private and public spaces, for better or worse, and possibly worse in some ways. So I think that kind of, so it's like, what are the frontiers that are left? Like whether they're inner spaces or, space exploration and so on, because, it does seem like, the domestic is everywhere. And it goes back to this point about safety and the kind of safetyism and the sort of trying to kill death or the elimination of death. And, I think one thing would be really interesting in another session perhaps to talk about is this question of risk, because it's so central. And, I do think that women have a relation to risk. And again, it's probably slightly different to men. And someone like Camille Paglia is fascinating on this topic, about what it means to actually be an adult, to actually, if you're a woman, to actually participate like in men's worlds, it is to take risk as well. And so that, but maybe there's a different way of conceiving risk in relation to the female. But yeah, I think so my answer would be that the inside and the outside, they're just kind of completely blurred basically at this point.
I have this little story in my head that I can't get out, and I think there's some relevant. I think the second man, Buzz Aldrin, or one of these, not number one, but one of the other guys on the moon, when he was up there, he said something on the radio, like they say all kinds of stuff, but he said, at one point he said, "Good luck, Mr. Watson." And no one, or some other name, I can't remember, let's just say Watson. And it didn't really make sense in the context, so no one really knew. But then what emerged, I don't know, they asked him afterwards or figured out, apparently the story is that when he was a child, his next door neighbor were Mr. and Mrs. Watson. And one day he heard from their window Mrs. Watson saying, oral sex, I'll give you oral sex when the neighbor's kid is walking on the moon. And the way this connects is, yes, it is true that men, we have this urge, yeah, we need to go to Mars, we want to go to, but ultimately, why do we want to go to Mars? It's not to be on Mars, it's order to come back and have oral sex. So there's like, yeah, going out and going in. And I think that's also another solution to the corona crisis. I think, maybe I shouldn't go in. I don't know. It seems, maybe it's just a conspiracy theory, but it seems that there's these people who want to do all kinds of crazy stuff, exploring our DNA and doing all this kind of stuff inside of us. Why do they want to do? Maybe if Dr. Fauci got some oral sex, we didn't have to take the vaccine. We could just, yeah, okay, fine, that's it. I'm just throwing it out there.
Yep, maybe. Someone get that man laid.
But it can't be a consumerist solution. Like he could just go to a prostitute and get oral sex. It would have to be the woman authentically wants to give him a blowjob, and that's a tough one because
we need to get Mrs. Fauci, yeah, going. I think that's the solution. We need to get. Maybe we can put her in a women's circle to rediscover her femininity, and then we can take Fauci to a men's circle, and then we'll get them together, and then we can all
they'll get divorced.
And not the vaccine.
Oh, wow. To go back to the original question, is as much as Dr. Fauci's sex life is, it may be the solution we've been looking for.
I think it is.
But it is really a tough one about the end of frontiers, because yeah, we don't have a lot of places to go, and it may be a question of men always shake up society enough to create new ones. I mean, we may be going through that, sooner than we think. I mean, like if you look at, like Minneapolis is on fire right now or whatever. Like there's, if you create chaos, then you can overcome chaos. And there's a lot, and that has to do with risks and whatever. If that's like, if we need to create something new, so something old must be destroyed. And so I think in many ways that's a frontier that maybe we end up creating them, because there's no more worlds to explore, but that has been our method for many years. Is obviously like that's why America exists, because like things were too crowded and people didn't have enough opportunity in Europe, and so they came over here and they got to start fresh, and there's nowhere to start fresh anymore. And as everybody said, space was supposed to be the final frontier, but that's probably not working out for a while. And I guess we talked about transhumanism, which is a really, really interesting topic. And that transhumanism is really what's coming down as the next frontier right now, which is terrifying. And like, why? I don't think Bill Gates's consciousness needs to be in a computer forever. I don't like that. But that's the dream, right? We can live forever if we go into the machine, and the machine is the new frontier. And that's where a lot of these people, I think, are expecting to find their immortality and expecting to go into the machine, and that's the new place. But I think at that point we do lose a lot of what makes us human and male, we don't know how to be computers. That's a tricky thing.
Well, I think transhumanists would agree with you. They just say, yeah, we don't want to be human. We don't want to be male. We want to be hyperdimensional imaginauts or something like that.
Yeah, they're species traders. Like there's
Fair
a problem
enough.
there, you hate us and you hate being what you are. That's concerning,
So we're at the bottom of the hour, and it feels like a good place to end. That was a really fun and enjoyable conversation. How about we just like go around the panel just briefly? Maybe I know for me, lots of threads opened up here that we're probably going to explore at the Stoa. Looks like there's a broa that's the hot demand in the chat, so we might have that here as well. But maybe any kind of closing thoughts or questions you're leaving with, and whoever feels called to go can.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess I already mentioned, I suppose, but I'm very interested in this question of risk and the sexual difference of risk, actually. And I think perhaps this question also of the question of whether to have a child or not, and how that plays out differently in the life, you know, the real life of men and women, you know, as a deep and serious question that often isn't kind of discussed at a kind of social or collective level in any sort of meaningful way. Like, I suppose the philosophical aspect of that, you know, choosing to bring another life into the world, but also, yeah, how men and women orient themselves in relation to questions of risk and questions of death, I think would be amazing to talk more about, basically.
I guess I can go next. I guess I started with the idea, you know, the question was, what does it mean to be a good man today? Like, basically saying, you know, what's the ethics of being a good man today? And this idea that the reason why this is such a problem is because there's a division and a collapse between ethics and the moral order. And that the past moral order was, say, Christianity or the patriarchy, and that we've been dealing with this for a long time now. And, you know, there hasn't been a solution yet. I would say that one of the things that I think about a lot is, what would it mean for the progressive left, or even thinking about beyond capitalist organization, having a theory of sexual difference, and having a theory of masculinity, or having even a place for a strong positive masculine role. And I would say the evidence for why that's so necessary is kind of the cultural phenomenon of someone like Jordan Peterson, because the cultural phenomenon of someone like Jordan Peterson created such a antagonism and such an anger, and he was so stereotyped as a conservative masculine person. And I think that this only shows that the symptom of the left is that they have no place for real men. And I think that is necessary, and I think that it will be necessary for the future of community. And we'll need a theory of sexual difference for that. So that's what I think.
So I just want to say, I just feel really optimistic about the future. I think it's gonna be great. And in this space of men and women, I actually think I see, if you look in the right places, I see a lot of women and men looking for and actually finding their womanhood and their manhood. I see more and more of that going on. And I will also say, sort of in the realm of the philosophical debate, I'm discovering the Stoa, and I still feel that I'm new to the Stoa. But I think the kind of conversation that I see here is, first of all, I don't see it very many other places. Maybe I'm not looking in the right places. But I'm not sure you could have found something like this just a few years ago. This way of talking about men and women, at least, yeah, I didn't see it just 2-3 years ago. So if you look in the right places, I think there's a lot of really, really good signs that we're moving forward in the right direction. So I think eventually Fauci's going to get his blowjob, and everything will be good.
The real question is whether Kurzweil's going to get to have embodied sexuality as a woman. This is what I want to know.
As far as wrapping up, for me, I love the idea of do men and women experience time differently, and of course, I can never know the answer. And I think that's the interesting part of the discussion between what men and women have as experiences is that, and one of the things that, you know, and I can get in trouble for this, but, you know, like the whole theory of trans and all that kind of stuff is like, we can never really know what each other's experience is. I can just like have a caricatured version of what I think a female's experience is, and she can have a caricatured experience of mine. But we really can't know and feel that. And to say that we can know and feel that, I think is a lie, and really takes away from both of our experiences, you know, because we do have a unique experience. And I think that that's important to retain it. And as far as I'm in Utah right now, and I was talking to a guy from Texas who came up to visit. So what's really interesting when we talk about political changes and everything that's happening in the world and the Fauci's blowjob and all these things is that a big ideological shift is happening in the point where the side that was called the right, and I don't even like that. I don't know what that doesn't really mean anything that makes sense. But really, the old liberals are becoming conservatives, and the conservatives are becoming liberals to the extent, like say in America, Republicans are now about to be poised to become the party people, which was not the case. But we don't have our mask mandate just went away in Utah, and it's been gone in Texas for weeks and weeks. And people are having parties, they're having barbecues, they're doing things. And then the people who are in the big cities who used to be liberals are the ones quoting government rules and talking about regulations, saying you can't do this and you can't do that. And the other guys will be like, hey, you want to have a barbecue? And so there's a big shift in what is permissive and what is not permissive. And the whole landscape is changing in a really interesting way right now. And that includes the discussion of men and women, because all these people who are, used to be the prudes, but are now going to be the fun people, are the people who are like, well, yeah, men and women are different. Of course they are. Yeah. And so that's happening in very different ways. So I think maybe the primacy of the discussion being held in the urban centers is possibly going to shift.
All right, very cool. I guess what I'm taking away with the main thing, the burning question, is Ola's Fauci obsession. We got to maybe perhaps have a session on that on its own. But a lot of great thoughts and threads emerged. So thank you, Nina, Jack, Ola, and Cadell for coming to the Stoa today. Just to briefly plug some upcoming events. Speaking of kind of the hopefulness that Ola was talking about, we have a session on existential hope, which is sort of a meme, sort of talking about the reverse or contrast to existential risk. So I'm excited for that. And Ola, you actually have a session coming up on, I think, May 2nd on family constellations. Do you want to kind of briefly plug that for us?
Yes, it's something I've been wanting to do for a while. I'm going to talk a little bit about what family constellation is, but we're actually going to do an actual live constellation with a real, I think it's going to be a woman, could be also be a man, and maybe there's room for 2 constellations. So anyway, so we're going to do it. And I'm excited to see what's going to happen in that space, because I've done it online before, but I've never done it sort of in an open live where there's more people, a lot more people. And yeah, so I'm really excited to see how that field moves. And I will confess to you, Cadell, I used to be a Lacanian, but now I'm a Jungian. So I'm going to go that route. So that's what we're going to be exploring in the family constellations space.
Very cool. Yeah, I've done family constellations before in person in Toronto, and it's quite weird and trippy experience. So I'm looking forward to that. That's a Patreon only event. Go on the thestoa.ca, check out all our events. Everyone, thank you for coming to the Stoa today.